Many people recognize that we aren't reaching the culture like we used to. We're not impacting the culture in our Western world. And in fact, when you think about it, America has the largest number of Christian churches, colleges, resources, Christian media in the entire world. But from a worldview perspective, America is becoming less Christian every day. Think about it. There are more Christian resources available now in America than we've ever had before, and yet it's still becoming less Christian every day. The United Kingdom has really gone down from a Christian perspective. It's a very pagan country, and many church buildings turned into mosques and antique stores and shopping centres and so on. Australia is becoming less Christian every day. Canada is becoming less Christian every day. We see moral relativism permeating the culture. The issues of gay marriage, the gender issue, the bathroom issue, the abortion issue, racism, euthanasia now more under discussion in various parts of our Western world. And not only in the culture do we see all these changes, but in the church as well. 2/3 of young people are leaving the church in America by the time they reach college age, and very few are returning. Actually, the same sort of thing is happening through the whole Western world. It's already happened in the United Kingdom, but certainly happening in a big way in America. And so we did research with America's Research Group back in 2009. We published the research in a book called Already Gone. That's had a great impact on a lot of churches in our Western world, because many pastors said that book really challenged them to change the way they were teaching people in their churches, and to really emphasize more apologetics and starting with Genesis and building a Christian worldview founded in Genesis. And that's really what the research showed, is that when the 20s generation who no longer go to church, who used to go to church, when they were asked, why did you leave church? A lot of it came down to the fact they weren't taught apologetics. They weren't taught an answer to the secular questions of our age. Most of them went to public schools where they were taught material that undermined the Bible. And instead of giving answers in our churches and homes, a lot of churches, Sunday schools and so on, just tell them, well, trust in Jesus. Well, it doesn't matter about Genesis. Well, you can believe what you taught at school about evolution a million years, just as long as you trust in Jesus. But these generations start to realize the message of Jesus comes from this book, and if the first part of the book, that history that's foundational to the rest of the book, is not true, then how can you trust the rest of the book? And that's really what's been going on. We also did research on the 20s generation that attend church regularly. And when we did the research on the 20s generation that are left in the church, I mean, two-thirds of them have already left the church. What about those that are left in the church? And we published this in a book called Ready to Return. We did that research in 2014. Here's what we found for the millennials that are still in our churches, that are left in our churches, regularly attending church, for those that didn't leave. Do you consider yourself born again? 40% outright said no. Do you believe if you're a good person, you'll go to heaven? 65% said yes. By the way, if 65% think if you're a good person, you'll go to heaven, and 40% say they're not born again, that 40% figure is far too low. It means it's much higher. Should gay couples be allowed to marry and have all legal rights? 40% outright yes, 10% don't know. Think about it, 50% of the millennials that are still in our churches will not stand against gay marriage. When we actually did research in 2015 as to how many people would come to the Ark encounter when we opened the Ark, we also had our researchers ask questions about the spiritual state of the nation. And one of the questions was this, and this is general population study. If you went to church regularly as kids, do you still attend most Sundays, or did you stop attending? And notice something. In the 60s generation, 22% of those that went to church have stopped attending. But look what's happening. In the 20s generation, it is 53%. That tells you where we're heading in America. And this has already happened to a large degree in most of the other Western nations. Also, George Varner recently released some research on Generation Z. Now, Generation Z for the Australians, but Generation Z is the post-millennials, right? They're the younger ones, teens, 13 to 18 years old. They're twice as likely as adults to say they're atheist. There's a change that's occurring. And in fact, I want to show you something that should scare us in regard to what's happening in this nation. It should be alarming for us, because I want you to realize the state of what's happening here. This shows very clearly the church is losing its impact on the culture big time. And let's have a look at this. So researchers in America divide generations into specific groups according to when they were born, and they give them names. So the greatest generation, they were the ones born before 1928. Anyone here in the greatest generation, by the way? Because actually sometimes we have one or two in the greatest generation. It means they're in their 90s. Okay, so actually on Sunday night I was speaking in Pennsylvania, in Pittsburgh, and I had one person who was in the greatest generation in the audience. So then there's the silent generation, those born between 1928 and 1945. Any of you in the silent generation? Okay, we see a number of hands. How about the boomers, 1946 to 64? See, that includes me too. See, look at all the boomers in here. Okay, and then Generation X, 65 to 1980. Quite a number of those. How about the millennials, 80s and 90s, the millennials? I always like to ask millennials if they know they're here. I just want to make sure of that, okay? All right, the post-millennials. Any post-millennials here? Younger generation? There's quite a number of you. Actually, one of the things that I've said a couple of times this week, when you look at the post-millennials, the millennials, they're growing up in a culture that is suffering the consequences of the failure of the church and the failure of the older generations to really raise up generations to stand unashamedly, uncompromisingly on God's word beginning in Genesis and know how to defend the Christian faith. And we're suffering the consequences of that right now. When you look at the culture and you see where it's at, and you say, what is wrong with the culture? I think that's the wrong question. The question to ask is, what is wrong with the church? And what has happened with the church? I think that is the question to ask. Now, let me show you these graphs. This is from Pew Research, and this was done in 2010, so it excludes the Generation Z, but they're really worse than any of these anyway. So, attendance at religious services by generation, percent saying they attend several times a week, every week, or nearly every week. Have a look at this. This is in America. In the greatest generation, 56% went to church. The silent generation, 40% of them go to church. Boomers, 32%. Generation X, 27%. The millennials, 18%. And Generation Z are under that. Keep in mind that as these here become the dominant group in the culture, what does that tell you about where the church is at in America? And people, if you want to look in England today, back before the last war, about 50% or more attended church. Today's down to less than 5 or 6%. And in fact, the number of churches in England has declined dramatically. Church buildings everywhere that are turned into all sorts of things. That's where America is heading. We're on the same track. We may be 20 years behind, but hey, Generation Z, millennials, you can help turn it around.